Happy Friday out there in Guitar Moderne land. Hope you're all doing well. Um, I don't know whether it's age or information overload, but I can't honestly recall exactly how I first discovered Rafiq Bhatia. It may have been a press release from his label Anti for his amazing solo record, Breaking English, which everyone should check out. It may have been a random YouTube video. I'm not sure. But nevertheless, I did discover him. I was blown away by the record. I did get to interview him around the record. And I also got to see him a couple of years ago at Big Ears. And I've written about how it was the highlight of that Big Ears. He and his trio were just one of the most amazing displays of modern guitar and modern music I'd ever seen. I did discover through talking to him at one point that he was a member of the band Son Lux. I had been totally unfamiliar with Son Lux and was amazed that I had been. It's such terrific music. It's modern music. It employs modern guitar. It has great singing. It can be described as David Bowie meets D'Angelo. It's the list of influences are unequaled, except by maybe someone like Bill Frisell. And the way they pull them all together into a cohesive whole is also unequaled. And so I was kind of disappointed that I didn't hear anything about the release that they did last year, which was actually three releases, three records, one, two, and three. But it's called Tomorrow's One, Two, and Three. And they're aptly named because it does sound like the music of tomorrow, although it fits perfectly into today. I felt I had to talk to Rafiq about the making of those records and about how a band like Son Lux develops a following that allows them to tour the world and make records like this and still remain under the radar of the mass popular culture, make amazing records like this. So we talked about that, but like Bill Frisell, Rafiq has a way of kind of going on tangents and has very interesting things to say that don't always directly relate to the question. So I think it makes for a great interview. But I'm still not exactly sure how Son Lux does what they do. But you should definitely check them out. They're on Spotify. And you should check out this interview because we discuss a lot of really interesting things. I would also suggest that you check out the website, guitarmoderne.com, and click through to my advertisers, my longtime advertisers, Red Panda and Earthquaker Devices. And also my new advertiser, Source Audio, a company that has been making modern pedals for a long time, and like Son Lux was under the radar for a long time, and is finally, I think, coming into its own and becoming well known as the other pedal companies, and becoming known for doing forward-thinking things. So please check their ad and click through to that. It'll all help me. I'll also put links to their sites in the description below. So without further ado, here's my interview with Rafiq Bhatia. This party started. So speaking of video interviews, I loved your Bill Frisell interview. And
Oh, thank you
today's
so
Bill's
much.
birthday.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's an auspicious day. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's fitting that two of the biggest Bill Frisell fans in the world speak to each other on this day. Um, did you enjoy doing that?
The interview, are
Yeah.
you kidding? It was a dream come true. Yeah. I mean, experience
Oh,
to get to pick the brain of one of my absolute all-time inspirations.
yeah. And it helps that he's just one of the loveliest people on the
Oh, yeah.
planet, which is
Yeah.
great. So I spoke to you first in 2018 for Electronic Musician. And unfortunately, they used to post those interviews online, and they've been through all this kind of stuff, and they're with Music Radar now, and they've just gone fully digital. But I don't know if
Hmm.
they're going to go back into the archives. But I'm just going to go for it. I'm gonna so we don't have to go back over all that stuff. I'm going to just post the interview. I'll the printed transcription with this, so people can look at that and get something about your background and all that kind of stuff that we discussed at that time. But then we spoke again in 2020 when you did that amazing performance from your house in lockdown, where you overdubbed four parts, including four video parts, and
Yeah.
achieved this kind of ghostly effect of blending the four, which I urge everybody to check out. It's also all they have to do is enter your name at Guitar Moderne, and it'll come up, and they can go from there. But back when we spoke back then, you said you had some things coming up that you couldn't talk about at the time. So I'm curious what those things were, and if you can talk about them now.
Um, I guess I can talk about more of them now, which is great. I feel like there's always something that still um, has to remain under wraps. But I think the big and most exciting thing that I was working on then that I'm able to discuss now is there's a new film that is going to be in theaters this Friday, March 25th, and then even more widely, I think this Friday it's just in New York, LA, and Chicago or something, and then by April 8th it'll be everywhere. But it's called Everything Everywhere All at Once. It's the new A24 film by Daniels, who are just absolutely insane directing duo, and it's a film starring Michelle Yeoh, Jamie Lee Curtis, Ki Hoi Kwan is in it, who like since playing Data in the Goonies and being in Indiana Jones 20 years ago, like hasn't had a role, and he's back and just like absolutely murders it in the film. And Stephanie Sue steps out into the light in a big way in the film. But it's a multiverse movie that like pushes the concept of multiple universes to sort of like philosophical extreme of like, if we have all of these universes and all of these things are possible, then what matters anymore, and it's kind of a in true Daniels form, it's simultaneously ridiculous and hilarious and supremely entertaining, but also like asks tough questions and has a lot of people crying by the end of it. And I'm just so excited for people to see this movie. And I got to work on the score with my collaborators Ryan and Ian and Son Lux. The three of us wrote close to 2 hours worth of music that's in the movie. So the
Wow.
movie is, I think it's like 2 hours and 10 minutes long, and it's almost wall to wall music. And the it's almost like the moments that don't have music stick out for being particularly spare, as opposed to the other way around. Like it's just like there's so much going on, and it's kind of like 4 or 5 albums worth of audio. And it was all written like very tightly to picture, like it's like scored in a way that is extremely specific and tries to reconcile all these different universes and all this sort of stuff. So that has been as you might imagine, a incredibly time consuming but also like incredibly rewarding thing that I've been doing over the last few years.
That's amazing. Well, first of all, I mean, the concept sounds custom made for the Son Lux crew. Um, but also, I'm pretty sure I watch a lot of movie previews,
Mm-hmm.
on Apple movies, although now all they show is stuff that's going to be on Apple Plus, which I don't have. But you know, and it comes up on YouTube. Once you start watching them on YouTube, they come up all the time. And I'm pretty sure I've seen a coming attraction for that. But the music probably at that time, I would think, is like just working what they call work tapes or something, whatever.
I mean, a lot of times
It
the
was any.
trailer and the film itself have totally different music, and that has mostly been the case with this one. Although just today they released a trailer that does have like a little snippet of particularly ridiculous choral music that is in the film, which like for anyone when they once you see the film you'll recognize where it's from. But it there because there's so much music and there are so many universes, it's sort of it pushed us in a lot of different directions, and we had to really find versions of ourselves that we didn't know existed for it, you know, because and they did, to your point earlier, like Daniels are extremely specific about music, and they came to us really early on before they even started shooting, um, because they, you know, like they had this vision for this being kind of all these different universes, and they knew that each of the three of us made our own solo music and had like, you know, worlds of sound associated with that that were distinct from Son Lux. And so they were like, okay, like these guys can sort of hopefully help us like craft all of these different identities for these different things, and then also find a way to bring them all together by the end. And it was crazy. Yeah, I can't still kind of can't believe that it's finally coming out and that people are going to get to see it.
Is there going to be a soundtrack album?
There is, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's coming out. I think it comes out April 8th. And the first single from that is already out right now, and it's actually a song that we got to make with David Byrne and Mitski. It's called "This Is a Life," and um, there's going to be some more music from it coming out soon, I think. But yeah, it's almost all of the score is on the album. I think it's like 49 tracks long or something.
Well,
So
great.
yeah,
I mean, why not?
yeah.
But it makes, I mean, as I said, it makes perfect sense because I've been immersing myself in Tomorrow's 1, 2, and 3, you know, and that contains multiple universes. And you're one of those bands, which I want to get into later, that is able
Mhm.
to somehow pull all that stuff together and make it just not seem pastiche or you know chopped up. You're not going from
Thank
one
you.
thing to another. It's all part of a part, which is spectacular. But yeah, so let's get into that. How did that those three records come about?
Um, so I mean, this is a band that, as long as I've been a part of it, has kind of constantly been making music. You know, I mean, I think we've taken a few short breaks, but it really, you know, like right on the heels of turning in the last album that we had finished, which was called Brighter Wounds. As soon as we like, you know, there's a period towards the end of all our projects, because we're so particular about, you know, because of so much of what the music is expressed, the way that the sound like moves through and out of the speakers is like a big part of what the music even is for us, you know. And so we see it through to completion in a way, and we're very hands-on with it to completion in a way that kind of like inevitably at the end of the process of finishing an album, we're like listening to the same audio over and over again with like a basically like totally like cold analytical scientific set of ears, like looking for like, you know, is there a tick in the right channel, or is it like, you know, like we're just like kind of finding all, we're dotting our I's and crossing our T's. And it can really, that tends to be a period in which all three of us are kind of like, okay, it would be so much fun to just start something new right now that doesn't have any of this associated with it yet, and it's just all we can imagine is like the full life that this thing could have ahead of it, or just nothing, you know, like no pressure for it to have any kind of legs after we started, just like let's play with ideas again. And so Ryan started doing this thing right after we handed in all of the tracks, where he was just like, okay, I'm going to take a month where every single day I start a new idea. And they were just like these little sketches, and he would label them like next one was day one, next two was day two, you know. And next one is on the album. It's called The Hours. It's on Tomorrow's Three. But yeah, there's a bunch of things that started in the aftermath, in that month that he just started making things. There were all these kernels and ideas that were never meant to be an album. They were never meant to go together necessarily, especially at first. It just sounded like almost like, you know, music by like 5 or 7 different artists in a single folder or something, you know, like he was just really like exploring a lot of different directions and doing whatever he wanted without thinking too hard about any of it. And not that long after that period, you know, he'd been sending us little ideas and stuff, and we were excited to hear everything. But we all got together in LA, and he played us. We just sat there and we like listened to everything that was in progress the three of us had. And we were kind of starting to talk about it, like, you know, maybe we should zero in on what we might want to focus on, or sort of narrow down the list of things that were open for the moment, you know, just to concentrate on stuff. And again, like still not really thinking of it as an album, but thinking of like what the things were that were calling to us in terms of like the next season of work that we might do. And we just kept listening to more and more ideas and not being able to like close any of the doors on any of them. Like we were excited and could see a direction that we wanted to explore in a lot of it. So we just decided to keep working that way, where we just had a lot of things open and on the table. And at the time, it was very late in the process. It was actually not until after the COVID sort of lockdown began that we decided that it was going to be parceled into 3 albums. You know, like at first we were thinking, okay, maybe we'll just release a series of single tracks or like short EP length things. You know, like we weren't envisioning it in any particular format. And the only thing that we were realizing that we were kind of running from was the idea of making a 10 or 12 track album. And part of the reason for that was because I think all of us were craving a way to kind of put some space inside of our music more, for lack of a better description. Like we felt like the past few recordings we had made between the three of us, we were proud of them, but we felt like they had a density that was you know, like it the pressure of having to like be constrained by that amount of time, you know, for a recording to exist between 45 and 60 minutes of length, and like wanting to kind of put you know, there's like inevitably for us a sense of wanting to include things. And I remember having conversations with Ryan and Ian early on in this process where we were like, you know, we don't have to cram everything into this small format. And in fact, like in this day and age, there's no reason why music needs to be in that format unless it's calling for it. You know, like there are obviously, all of us are big fans of the album, and we're fans of like the idea of music existing in that way, but we wanted to kind of approach it more from the standpoint of like, what is the intention behind organizing music in a certain order and certain duration. And so there's a lot of sections throughout those records that are purely instrumental. It's not just like a series of songs that are back to back to back. And I think it, is reflective of a lot of those kinds of intentions. Yeah.
It's funny when you started talking about space. I thought you were talking about space within the music, and because that's something I noticed. I mean, something about the band, or at least on those three records, is that there is a lot of space in the music, even though
Yeah.
it sounds harmonically dense, rhythmically complex, and there's a lot going on, and sonically lush. There's not a lot of stuff piled on top of other stuff most
Mm-hmm.
of the time, so that was one thing I noticed about it. Because the next thing I want to ask, so you started to explain um, that you got together in LA pre-COVID and started on this pre-COVID, but once the lockdown started, how did you keep working on it? Because it came out last year kind of during
Mm-hmm.
COVID.
Well, I mean, I think we're very fortunate in that the three of us have been living in different cities and working from a distance for a really long time. And it wasn't, that didn't really change on its face in terms of, COVID um, constraints. But I think another thing that really helped us is that we had had a few really concentrated windows. Like we often will come together in a single location for a few weeks at a time and do a lot of recording. We'll do sampling sessions with people. We'll kind of like amass materials that will build the sort of like sculptural beginnings of new tracks from. And then at a certain point, we've been passing things back and forth long enough that the music's in a form where a structure starts to emerge, where we might want to like more specifically, create building blocks with that structure in mind. And so then we'll get back together and we'll do more recording. And we had just done, I think it was 2, if not 3 weeks in New York in the fall of 2019. And then right before, like the week that the lockdown started, that weekend, we all flew home from a week-long trip to LA, where we were actually also working on materials for this soundtrack. So we went and we were on set for a few days, and then we were in the studio gathering stuff for the soundtrack. And we so we had a lot of things that were like already had their own momentum. We had a ton of materials that we were still mining for potential. And moreover, the three of us all are very comfortable with working from a distance. We all record ourselves, we all produce and make electronic music. So it's kind of it was something that we were able to really like put it together from afar without it being too crazy. But yeah, I mean, there were definitely aspects of it that came together in unexpected ways. Ryan had gotten on a plane to Indianapolis from LA thinking that he was going for a few days, and he ended up moving there for the whole pandemic. He's still there. And I think they're probably going to move back to LA in the fall for at least the next year. But he like, definitely got on a plane thinking he was going for like a week and just never came back.
He usually lives in Indianapolis.
He does now. Yeah, he was living in LA before that.
Yeah.
So, but he ended up finding a place. One thing led to another, and they realized that it was a better choice for their family to be out there during that time. And he found, our manager also lives in Indianapolis and knew somebody who was not going to be at home for a long time. So that house turned into Ryan's studio, and he like recorded vocals at a little station in the kid's bedroom with like two twin beds on either side of him. And like, there are a bunch of things that were just like kind of hilarious. But it came together that way, and we feel like the music sort of relates a lot. It was almost like certain things that we were experimenting with before the pandemic. And again, for people who aren't familiar with our music, the way that we work, oftentimes the lyrics come last, and the song sort of emerges out of a world of sound that gets cultivated that then suggests a form. And then the lyrics sometimes are like, it's almost like it's the lyrics are scoring or speaking to what's happening in the music in a way that allows for what feel like production decisions that would be very hard to come up with if you work the other way around. And in the music that we had started, there were all of these moments where there was kind of like a sustained kind of tension, like two things drifting, like starting in sync and drifting out slowly, or like, elements fanning out and losing, like losing coherence and gaining it for a moment, but then losing it again, and the idea of sitting with sustained tension was a recurring theme throughout all of this work. And in that time, it started to become obvious what that could mean, from the vantage point of like what a song inside of that might suggest. So it was kind of uncanny for us, like being in the middle of circumstances that just felt like the music had always been about that or something.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. It's the vocals never see. I'm given that you do it that way. The vocals, even though they do, they're. I mean, on some of the more pop type tunes, what I would call pop type tunes, where there are more vocals. I have a very loose definition of pop,
So
but
do we.
but
Yeah.
yeah, but well, that's another discussion I want to have in a little bit. But it seems, I mean, the vocals do not seem, and sometimes when the music comes first and the vocals come later, the vocals sometimes seem buried in the music, but that's never the case, partly because he has such a strong voice, Ryan has such a strong voice, but also partly because I think of some of the space that I was talking about that exists in the music. So no matter whatever you were doing, there's a sonic space for the vocals in it. It sounds like you're playing. There's a lot of bass, bass type guitar sounds on the
Yeah.
record, and it sounds great. And I was curious, is that real bass? Is that the baritone that you were talking about that you have that you use with an octaver? Or it's just such a great sound. I was wondering how you get it.
Yeah. Thank you. So before I start talking about what I did, I have to give credit to my friend Jackson Hill, who is an amazing bass player who actually just released his first EP today. So I'm really excited about that at the moment. I
Yeah, I saw
mixed
that on
that and
Instagram.
it's out. But he's somebody who, like we learned to play music together, and he's been a big influence on me. One of the biggest influences on me as I've started to kind of find myself in this position. Like I never set out to be a bass player, but I love the bass. Like if for years when people have asked me like what I thought was the most important component of a band, I would, shout out the bass player, because it really is just like, it's such a um uh transformative role, and it's definitely something that, and also I have a low speaking voice, and somebody pointed out to me at some point that, like on some level I hear, like there's like some resonance between just like that personal aspect and where the ideas sit on that instrument, um but I think so anyway, part of the reason why I'm shouting out Jack is because he does play bass on some of the tracks. So he's on Honesty and he's on Undertow. Those are both on Tomorrow's One. And then he's also on Live Another Life, which is like kind of hard to discern that there is bass on that song because it's reversed and kind of weird. But all the other ones are me, and it's all different instruments actually. I never played like a real bass, so it's either a baritone guitar that's in B tuning, so the lowest note is B, below the E, or it's actually just my regular electric guitar with the bottom note being an E, um, but just using pitch manipulation to get the sound. I mean, a lot of other things too, but that's something that I've been doing when the three of us play live for a really long time, and it's popped up a little bit on other Son Lux records. I did it on You Don't Know Me off of Bones. I feel like there's got to be some Brighter Wounds tracks where I play some version of bass, but it's something that I've been doing for a really long time as a part of our live performance practice, and that's not necessarily something that gets documented on our studio recordings because traditionally we haven't really been the type of band that like, again, like we're writing from the process, from the perspective of the studio, and so we're sort of working with audio in this more sculptural kind of way, and it's not like we like come up with an arrangement and then we record it. It's sort of the other way around. Like right now when we're preparing for a tour and we're like learning how to play all the songs, we're learning what it means to play all of the songs on the instruments that we play. But all that to say, I've been playing bass in the band, or playing, low end guitar or whatever you want to call it in the band for quite some time. And at first it was just something, I mean, it was born out of, and it continues to be fueled by the fact that I just hear ideas down there that aren't being represented by anyone else. And I'm like, okay, well, this is what I'm hearing right now, and that's what I'm going to play. And it sort of has turned into, we were just rehearsing for a couple weeks and I realized that I was playing in that register on every single song. Like I'm like almost like the bass player on 2/3 of the material, which is it's kind of a new space for me, and it's one that I really, really enjoy. And I think it helps also to like, you know, like getting to play that role with Ian Chang playing drums is extremely fun, because we've always had sort of a particular sort of approach to expressing rhythm together. And I've usually, like I primarily have come at that from the vantage point of the guitar, but I think we've developed like a whole vocabulary of like like rhythm section, bass and drums, for lack of a better word, sort of hook up. And it's, especially after 2 years of not getting to do it, it just feels like the best thing in the world to like get to play like that again.
Well, it's amazing because you have a very distinctive sound. I mean, it's it doesn't sound like any other kind of bass or bass player or keyboard bass, or it has a very, but it fulfills both a harmonic, rhythmic, and melodic place in the music. And live, it seems you go back and forth. I mean, you can go back and forth with, sometimes within the same tune.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I noticed that was interesting is, well, I'll get there in a minute, but I wanted to get into we in the original interview we talked about, you talked about how you grew up listening to D'Angelo before you even played
Oh
guitar,
yeah.
and that Spanky, um, sound, that gospel guitar thing that he had and that has now become huge, apparently. It's just, it's all over the place, is very evident in your guitar playing.
Mm-hmm.
And you go back and forth. But since we talked, I mean, that's a long time ago, I've, you'll pardon the expression, drilled down into Dilla, a little bit, because some guy had a video. If anybody listening to this or watching this wants to know what we're talking about when we're talking about Dilla, there's a guy on YouTube. Maybe I'll try and find it and put it in the down below, who really goes into how that stuff is put together and what makes it great and how it's about different parts, the way he programmed it, different parts dragging while other parts are straight and other parts are doing something else. And it shouldn't work. And it's kind of one of those things like listening to microtonal guitar that at first you think it's out of tune, but then the more you listen to it, the more it kind of makes sense. And, the Dilla groove to me is one of those things at first you think this is weird, but then because it's on the grid, and it keeps playing it exactly like that over and over and over again, you get into the feel of it. And Ian seems to have it down. I mean, I know a lot of drummers have started incorporating that feel into their playing. So I wanted to ask you about that, and how much of that, I mean, is a part of the Son Lux sound, and how you've gotten that in there.
Oh man, I mean, we're tremendously indebted to Dilla. Like that's a huge influence for all of us. And not just Dilla's music itself, which actually like right now, very recently, I think all three of us have been listening to Dilla a lot more than we were maybe when we were making that music. And some of the stuff that we're doing live is like really, really influenced by, like the primary source material, in a way that like, maybe some of what's on those recordings, like it's not just Dilla, but it's also the impact or like the like ripple effect that Dilla's production had through hip hop music in general and beyond, and so for me, like growing up, I mean, obviously like D'Angelo is a big touchstone, and yeah, you mentioned Spanky, and like there's like all these great guitar players that played with D'Angelo, but for me it actually was more D'Angelo himself. Like if you listen to what the background vocal, like all of D'Angelo's layered vocals are doing, that's where a lot of my guitar stuff is coming from, is like trying to see if I can make like he has these like, it's almost like, there'll be six vocals that are singing a version of the same line, but they all have their own different contours, and it forms this like almost like a bouquet or something, like a melismatic bouquet. And that's the sound that I've been chasing for a really long time. It's all over the Son Lux stuff. And yeah, I mean, I think like for me growing up, also Madlib was a huge influence, who was is a living, breathing sort of like testament to that generation. He and Dilla did a lot of work together when Dilla was alive, and he's another person who's just had like a sort of ripple effect through that music, and by extension like all modern music in terms of how we think about time. And to go to that point that you were making about like it being off grid, or like elements of the music sort of being off of the like normal way of articulating time or thinking about time, I think it's useful to point out that like for anybody who's ever tried programming drums by like lining up samples or MIDI notes onto a grid and like hitting play, that's the thing that's weird, is what a computer does when you tell it to play in time, because it really plays in time in a way that is unwavering and is unaffected by like how we feel in our bodies, or like where our breaths are landing, or our brains sort of like constantly wavering sense of time passing, and like the feeling that we're used to is actually of intentional micro timing. Like it's like not what a computer does when a computer articulates the grid. And the funny thing about Dilla is like the part of it that makes it lurch is the tension between the timing of a computer and the timing of a human being, and there being certain elements within a program beat that stick unwaveringly to the computer's sense of time, and then other elements that push against that very intentionally in a human way. And that's one of my favorite examples of something that I feel like I'm kind of always lifting, like a concept that I'm always lifting and trying to apply to other areas, which is like what happens when, because for Dilla, like a lot of that was also coming from having listened to the great jazz drummers and drumming, West African drumming and all this, like this whole tradition of the drums as a sort of repository of knowledge and information and storytelling, and like how do you move that into what a sampler can do in a way that's true to all of those things, and then all these drummers heard what he was doing and were like, okay, this is a part of that, this is another step or another direction in that same inquiry that we're all a part of, and so we're going to keep building on it. We're going to take that and bring it back to our instruments and keep building on it, and in turn now you have things like sensory percussion, which is this new technology that Ian is using and a lot of other drummers are using, that was developed by a really great drummer, and it allows very precise sort of information about a drummer's feel and the nuances of their touch and how they're playing the instrument to be translated back into the electronic realm. And so now producers can take what drummers are doing with Dilla and bring that back into how people are making electronic music. And so it's this whole exchange that is happening continually where, like, the ideas themselves can start to develop beyond the instruments, and I know that we've kind of gone a little bit off the track of my bass sound, but that's like,
Well,
that's sort of, for me, I guess the answer to that question is that I'm not necessarily, if it sounds distinct or different, part of it might be that I'm not thinking about it so much in terms of like, how do I sound like a bass, and more just in terms of like what do all these other mediums that are not the bass tell me about what might be possible in approaching that role,
Well, yeah, which I was going to ask you about that because I mean, I was curious how it feels to play to that kind of beat. In other words, I know Pino Palladino with D'Angelo, he would just sit down the middle and let it go around him. As I understand it, that he was holding it down, John Entwistle style, and while the rest of it moved around him. Am I wrong about that? I mean, the way you're looking.
Well, it's more complicated than that, I would say. Yeah, I think, and also like I just said that, like, I wasn't listening to the bass, but like the one bass player besides Jack who I really have listened to a lot. I mean, there are more bass players in this, but Pino is a huge influence. But it's more about like some of the conceptual things about like how to function inside that context, like the question that you're asking, and like, I mean, a lot of the answer is actually, for people who haven't necessarily been in that role before, like it's kind of similar to like like when I've heard people talk about Duke Ellington's band and tuning within a horn section, like when you play everything like with a very precise kind of intonation, you can get a certain kind of sound, but if you intentionally widen the tuning, between instruments, you can get a fuller, richer, denser kind of sound, and that may not be the thing that's called for in every situation, but to the extent that you're able to intentionally widen um, the tuning, you can sort of get to colors that are not necessarily, you know, that are not accessible by like always being like, you know, kind of rigidly in tune. And that's the same thing about like where you place a beat, you know. Um, and Ian and I, we might place the note in such a way that like the transient lines up exactly. And so that's like, the attack of my note and the attack of his kick are like in the same exact spot. But that might not necessarily be the thing that sounds that way. And part of that is because my bass sound might contain frequency information that's at a different wavelength than his kick drum, part of the way that we hear the precise placement of a rhythm is based on what register it's in, because a bass note has a long wavelength, and so there's a long distance that it takes to develop. And so, when I've recorded really great drummers, I've looked at where they're putting different drums in relation to where the grid is. I've looked at the waveforms in my, computer, and like a lot of the time the kicks will be ahead of where the beat is, but it doesn't sound like they're ahead. It sounds like they're like on it, and that's because it takes that long for that waveform to register into a beat in my ear, and so similarly, like the impression to our ears that two things are aligned doesn't mean that they're actually like in the same place in an absolute time sense, if you follow what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, there's kind of different places, there's different sweet spots. So there's a sweet spot where the notes are on top of each other. There's another sweet spot that I found that's kind of the widest expression of the beat that feels like we're on the same beat, but it just feels wider, which is like, if you look at the waveforms, his kick will hit and it's got this like slope, like there's a decay in the waveform. Yeah. And if my bass note, which is rounder, if I play the bass note with a rounder, more blooming expression, it can nest right in there, coming off of the attack, and it together, like you can look at it visually and you see this like brick of sound. And that is a really wide articulation of a beat, you know what I mean? Like just from like it sounds really full. And so I think we're always kind of like playing with where the two of us are putting the beat in relation to where the time actually is, and then also in relation to each other in terms of how tight or full each beat is articulated. So that's like a very specific answer to your question, but
no, it's just, there's so much, there's so much information in there, and there's so much, there's so much to deal with there. I mean, in terms of, first of all, the horn thing you mentioned, I mean, that's what Stax horn players did for years, because there would be fewer of them, so they would intentionally not play perfectly in tune. I mean, I tell the story. I went to see this band. There was it was a function band. We call them casual bands or whatever, but it would, they did industrials and stuff, and it was a soul band. It was Mark Cohn. Have you ever heard of him? He had a pop single, but great singer, and he had this band that played industrials and stuff, and they had horns. And my first wife had a really good, she wasn't a musician, but she had this really good sense of music. And we walked in and they were playing, and the first thing she said was, the horns are too in tune. Because they sounded like a Vegas horn section, not like a soul horn section. So, there's a big way, and I think, most sophisticated musicians understand that the beat, the one is there's all sorts of room around it. And it's funny you mentioned your bass blooming, because your bass, that's part of the sound that I always get, because I know you ride the volume pedal a lot, and I know you compress things a lot, and there is a bloom to your bass sound, and it does sit there. I mean, with the kick. I mean, Son Lux is not usually, for the most part, one of those bands where it's about some sort of pounding groove that where
Yeah.
it's all about the bass and bass drum locking in and that kind of
Mhm.
stuff. It is more about texture and sound and how things work together. And you guys do work great together. Obviously, you've played together for a long time. A lot of times, but even in pop music, a lot of times the bass drum, it will be the thing that provides the attack, and then it will be cued with less bottom end, and then the bass will be the thing that provides the note, and so
Mhm.
they work together in that sense, and you guys do work together in that sense. So I guess what you're saying, vis-a-vis my kind of original question, is that you're not playing necessarily, he's not playing around you, you guys are moving together
Yeah.
is the
Yeah.
deal. The other thing about his playing is I would describe it as kind of Dilla meets Paul Motion, because a lot of his playing has that falling down a flight of stairs
Yeah.
feeling to it, and which
Oh, I'm
also,
gonna tell him you said that. He'll like
uh,
that.
yeah, well, I hope he thinks of it as a compliment.
I think he'll like it. Yeah.
Yeah, but it's true, and which it also relates to something else that watching you guys play live with Son Lux, there's a lot of times when you're not playing bass, when Ryan is not filling it in on the keyboard, the band seems very comfortable with there not being any bass information except
Yeah.
for Ian's bass drum. And I was wondering where that comes from, and what your concept of that is.
Yeah. Well, you incepted Paul Motion into this conversation, so I will start there because those trio records with Frisell and Joe Lovano were pretty formative for me. And also the first time that I ever heard Bill play live was with that band. And it was, for anyone who saw that band, who had the good fortune of seeing that band, it's totally different than the records.
Oh, yeah.
It was, I had heard these like really calm, sort of like minimal pastoral sounding record dates that they had done for ECM, and then I came to the Vanguard and it was like a lion roaring in my face. Like it was just so intense and visceral and amazing. And but yeah, no bass player. And I think that maybe was like some of my early um exposure to that idea. But I don't know. I mean, I don't know that we have like a frame of reference for that so much as I think we just try to approach any kind of distribution of frequency information in the band as like a possibility. You know what I mean? Like it's like there doesn't always, we don't want to take for granted that there needs to be somebody playing a role where, sound is being articulated in that register. Like it's really, we're sort of just listening for what things sound like. And I will say that like I play the guitar very differently when there's stuff filling that register versus not. And I think Brian and Ian both play their instruments differently accordingly. There's certainly things that guitar sounds that I can get away with when there's nothing happening down there that may not register as having a bass responsibility because of how active they are. But like if you had a bass player and I had that low octave in the guitar sound, it would sound muddy, but it wouldn't if there wasn't.
Sure,
Um,
that makes sense.
so sometimes you can get this kind of larger than life guitar thing happening in the absence of a bass, or something like articulating down there. Um,
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, when there's a bass, I mean, when I was first attempting to play jazz, I was playing in this band with a piano player, and I was trying to lay down, some of the low end, for her to tinkle up front. And then we went in to make a record, and I got schooled by the bass player who was saying, you don't have to play down there. I'm here. So, it has to be appropriate. I want to ask you about Apart. The song Apart. It starts
mhm,
with something that sounds like kind of a Molly esque
mhm.
type thing. Or have you studied that style? Or are you into that style?
I
of
love that style. I haven't studied it. I've like, I'm so into it though. And I think, yeah, I mean, that's guitar, and it's prepared guitar. So there's something that I do pretty often. I mean, I do different kind of things where I'll prepare the guitar, but the one that I gravitate to the most is this sort of it's like a packing foam material that I weave through the strings, and it's similar to like putting a piece of paper through the strings, but it has kind of a simultaneously like thicker and more like it's thicker, and it also has more air frequencies, like that, like, you know 15, 20, 40 kilohertz stuff. Like it's like really like ASMR sort of sounding up there. um and it allows the enough of the note through that there's still like a fullness, like it doesn't sound thin, but it kind of, yeah, that's the right material that I found for that
is,
sound. And
is it like peanuts, that kind of thing, that kind of foam
no, it's
stuff?
like the like more of a, in fact, I think the way that I discovered it was like, if you buy an Ernie Ball volume pedal, it's wrapped in like a white kind of foam
Oh, I know what that
thing.
is.
Like
Yeah. Yeah, of
that's
course.
what I'm
Yeah.
talking about. It's like you
Yeah.
can cut that out, and about an inch thick or whatever, and get it through all the strings and right near the bridge. And you can sort of, I mean, experimenting with the length of it will do different things for you. But I've sort of settled on a certain width for it. And um, yeah, that's a sound that I really love, and it sort of transforms my guitar into a more percussive instrument that allows me to play it differently. I mean, that's what all of these like different, be they like acoustic alterations to the instrument or electronic ones, like I just enjoy like turning it into a different instrument and then being like, okay, how do I play this now? um and yeah, so it allows me, I think all three of us in Son Lux like wish we were drummers. And so that's like one instrument where I get to, I didn't do it so much on that track, but like it allows me to sort of play a more percussive role. It's like sort of like almost like a thumb piano.
Right, right.
um
On tomorrow's three, it starts off with Unbind, which and for those that want the big guitar solo, that's the big guitar solo. That's um, I'm assuming your destructo distorted sound on that. Is that your modified fuzz factory?
I can't remember honestly what it was, but I think it's definitely some, it might be the original, just like the Fat Fuzz Factory, the first one that I got. I've been using that one again lately. It just sounds so good. But I think it was that I had a couple amps. I was using these Space Tone amps that I really love, and I had two of them.
The Swartz.
Yeah, I had two of them, and I was recording in stereo. And but I can't remember whether I still had both of them up, because that was at the very end of a few weeks of recording, and we didn't think we were going to do any more guitar that day. But after Ian played what he played, I had to go in and play something. So that song is, so for people who watch this film, you'll notice that there's some common DNA between that song and the film. And we were kind of working on both things at the same time. And but while we were working on that one, there's that string stuff, which was we were kind of exploring this idea of like sustained contamination with the strings. And so we recorded a version of it that's like, just like playing it with poise and conviction and, you know, energy and assuredness. And then there's another there are like versions of it that are more contaminated and fucked up and terrifying, and those like over time we're like playing with that balance until it starts to unravel. But the thing that we were inspired by while we were working on that, and that we were watching videos of in the studio even, there's this footage which I think originally aired on Planet Earth, and it was of this pride of lions that had been, it'd been weeks they'd been looking for food and couldn't find any food, and it was like it was approaching the colder months, and they like really needed to eat. If they were going to live, they needed to eat. And they started following this, this herd of elephants. And, like that's a very dangerous proposition for an elephant, or for a lion. An
Yeah, I
elephant
was
is
gonna
like
say for the lion
you know,
too.
yeah. So it's like primarily like, especially like a herd of elephants, like lions are not going to stand a chance. But there's this video where they try anyway, and they kind of like, there's an elephant that breaks off from the pack, and they like go after the elephant, and it's just like one of the most like intense things that I've ever seen in my entire life. And it's really it's like devastating in a way that is just, you know like it's difficult to like, especially in our way of living, and kind of like even the way that we like get our food and our connection to like where the food on our plate comes from and stuff like that, like we don't really think about what that part of existing is, at least I don't, in
We
my
don't
like
we don't have to go
removed,
out and kill it.
yeah, in my removed city sort of life. And yeah, so it's like it kind of plays out in the way that that video plays out, where like at first the elephant is just like, you know determined to like outlast this ambush from the lions, but like it doesn't work out that way. And it's sort of like we were like playing like a kind of almost like a musical response to the video.
Well, it sounds like it ends with some acoustic guitar at the end. So is that some sort of denouement?
That was, yeah, that was more of, it's actually foreshadowing another song on the record, and it's sort of like, yeah, it sort of brings us out of that space into a different space, before we move on with the record. But yeah, we weren't just going to leave people on that note. In fact, we started on that note for a reason. So
Well,
yeah.
yeah, that track I wrote there encapsulates one of the things I love about Son Lux. I mean, you're not afraid to go from completely noisy and distorted and atonal to romantic virtually romantic within the same song. And you're comfortable with combining genres as I discussed before, but not just in a collage or pastiche way, but really integrating different genres into the music to where it all somehow works. I mean, and outside of Scandinavia, I don't hear that much. I mean, Scandinavian musicians like Harold Anderson and Ivan Arset, Nils Petter Molvar, I don't know if you're familiar with those guys, but, in general, over the years, Scandinavian musicians think nothing like Errol Anderson will do a record, they'll be doing the songs of John Donne, but he'll have this guitar player Frode Alneas on it, who is not very well known. He's actually a comedian in Norway, but he's a
Wow.
brilliant guitar player, kind of out of the Terje Ripdahl, Ivan Arset school. And he'll be playing some blazing weird guitar in the middle of this, you know, woman singing the poems of Jean Donne. And, in general, they just don't think anything of that in Scandinavia. That, they're
Mm.
and Son Lux reminds me of that, and you seem to do the same thing, which leads me to one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about, which is that prior to, I'm not sure how I discovered you as a guitar player, whether it was your first record. I think somehow I discovered that, your solo record. Um, and then through that, I discovered Son Lux. And I realized, I mean, obviously, I do this for a living, and I'm aware of most of what's out there, although it's impossible to keep, be aware of everything these days. And I had never heard of Son Lux. And then I'm checking it out and I'm going, this music is amazing. But what's almost more amazing is that you seem to have this base, a fan base and following where you can fill theaters and tour internationally, mount international tours. And I'm curious, and you're not alone in that. I'm discovering more and more that there are dozens, if not hundreds, of bands around like that are not many of them as musically adept necessarily, but a lot of really interesting bands that have these, you'd call it a niche following,
Mm.
except that it's enough that seems to sustain national and international touring. So even this one guitar player I interviewed for Guitar Moderne, who does plays through a laptop doing the synth guitar stuff and like really odd stuff. I mean, he has a whole career doing this, and pre-pandemic, many of these bands were touring, and I'm just curious how that works. How did Son Lux, either before you or since you, develop that kind of base and following?
Oh, well, that's a question that, I mean, I'm thankful that I don't entirely know the answer because, like it's certainly not like um yeah, I don't think anyone can exactly break down the way that sound travels through the world and connects with people, and that people develop relationships to a thing. um I joined the band, Ian and I joined the band in 2014, and that was the first. We originally were just touring musicians that Ryan um asked to help him figure out a way to play the 2013 Son Lux album Lanterns live, which again was like constructed in a way where he wasn't thinking about how to play it live or that he would ever play it live. And both Ian and I were, musicians who were coming from the vantage point of like playing an instrument and playing in bands that sort of foregrounded that approach, but we were both really interested in people who were making music electronically, and um who are kind of on the cutting edge of like what like these production tools could offer, and music making as a more sculptural sort of approach, like I was saying before. And I think both of us saw in Ryan like, oh, here's somebody who's doing that. And as different as all three of our musical backgrounds and aesthetics are, there is a lot of overlap. And one thing that really overlaps, I think, is that none of us, like all of us, have a kind of long-term connection to an interest in the like American popular song format, and also like other music that has sort of you know um achieved a very wide following. Like I'm obsessed with hip hop. That was the music that I really started out um sort of resonating with, and that's become one of the more influential musics, if not the most influential music of the last 20-30 years. And the people who started making that certainly didn't think that it was going to be like that when it started. You know what I mean? Like it was born of community inquiry and experimentalism that was in the spirit of like, you know, tapping into like a community expression and need. And you know, so I think the three of us maybe share in common that like we don't automatically turn our nose up at something if it's popular, you know, like that doesn't disqualify it from our, you know, interests. And in fact, the more that we've been engaged with music that has those kinds of, you know, like that where people come out in mass to the concerts or they're buying the records and stuff, behind a lot of that music we found like some of the most creative and boundary pushing people, and they're doing some wild shit, and it just usually is along metrics that people who listen to more experimental music might not necessarily appreciate or realize like how adventurous or different it is, you know. And I think like early on all three of us separately kind of realized that there was experimentation happening in all of these areas, you know, and that capital E experimental music isn't necessarily actually experimenting or pushing things. There's a lot of music that is considered to be experimental because it's associated with a period 50 years ago where people were experimenting, and now you're like doing that same thing and calling it experimental because it once was, you know. And so I guess the first thing is that like we don't, you know, like I wouldn't take for granted that music that sounds you know, like it's associated with that school of thought or that history is necessarily pushing any, you know, opening any new doors, you know.
No, guitar players were sticking things under their strings like 50
Yeah,
years
like it's
ago.
like it's
That's not,
not,
yeah.
a lot of these things are not new. And I think what has drawn all three of us like over the years is more the thing where it's like you hear a recording and in 2 seconds you're like, okay, that's this person, or that's this band, or that's this composer, or whatever it is, you know, this ensemble. Like that is not about, you know, um experimentalism per se. It's more about like developing a personal relationship to music and making enough decisions about the music that you're making. Like there's enough aspects of it that are kind of decided upon in a way that's not taking anything for granted or making assumptions about how music should be, that very quickly it's clear that it's you that made it, you know. And that's more of a test of the thing rather than the importance of the thing, maybe, you know. Like it's I think we're all drawn to people and musicians and artists across all of these lines, you know, who made music that was sufficiently personal that that thing could relate, you know. And I think there's a lot of music that I love where there were only 6 people in the audience where when that live record was made, or there, you know, like, and I cherish that music more than a lot of music that a lot of people love, you know what I mean? But there's also music that I love where there were like millions of people listening to that thing when it came out, and it does a similar thing for me, you know. But I think both in, you know, certainly in the world of pop music and that whole, you know, because anything that's profitable has a sort of industry of people who thrive off of it. And, you know, like there's a lot of gross stuff associated with that, you know, like there's a lot of intentions that have nothing to do with music or like people connecting with music or whatever. associated with that, but I guess that doesn't necessarily mean that the music itself doesn't have um, legs that go deeper than that, or like roots that go deeper than that, or that it doesn't connect with people, um, you know, in a way that's deeper than that. So,
Well, there's two streams to this. One
yeah,
is what you're talking about is a musical voice, which, I'm very into. And, people that have a distinctive musical voice where they can, as Santana said, if your mother can recognize you on the radio, that's the goal, you know,
yeah,
and
that's a good way to put it. Yeah.
and that's the thing. And if people know it's you right away,
Mhm.
that's an important thing. It's not always the road necessarily to, success, quote unquote success in terms of popularity. But then there's the other end of it, as it's a music business. I mean, when I try and think about this, I think, and I think about a band like yours, it
Mhm.
has something for everybody. I mean, there's beautiful melodies, there's lush strings, there's rock and noise, there's the occasional groove, but a lot of times music that has something for everybody doesn't manage to attract anybody. I mean, the common wisdom is the common wisdom, which is not particularly wise, is that you want to follow one path and, give that to people. But we live in an era where bands like Radiohead and Bjork fill stadiums.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to do is square that circle and figure out sort of how that works. I mean, and I'm just curious. I mean, if you get to talk to your fans at some of these theater
Mhm.
shows, what kind of other music are they into? What brings them to your band?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite things about touring is that we usually do talk to our fans after the show. Like we go out afterwards and hang out and talk to folks. And I don't know how much of that we're going to be able to do on this tour because of COVID reasons. But I hope that at least in certain situations it's possible for us to continue doing that, because that, first of all, is like, when you have a job that you love so much and that's so fulfilling, it can almost feel like selfish or something. You know what I mean? Like I'm just up there every night, like doing this thing that I love doing, that I dreamed of doing when I was a kid. Like it feels very like you're like, this couldn't possibly be helping anyone else if it's giving me so much. Um and so, and that's something that I struggled with when I like thought about making music in the first place, was like, you know, I have comparatively every opportunity. Like, why don't I just go do something that's like more directly of service to others? Like, and there was a moment, you know, when I think I realized, I was like talking to another person who was doubting the decision to be a musician, and I was telling them how much their music had meant to me over the years and how much it had changed my life. And that was part of what made me realize that it does that. Like I wasn't looking at myself and realizing that music had been one of the most impactful forces in my own life at the time that I was making that, characterization of myself, and or of my intention or whatever. And this thing of like going out and talking to people after the show is really instructive in that regard, because it reminds you that, like, I mean, I don't want to get into like too many specifics, but we've heard some extremely personal stories from folks about like why they were there that night, and like what the music had meant to them. And that's really like, you know I can't think of a better reason to do anything than some of that. So it's
Absolutely.
sort
Yeah.
of like,
Yeah.
yeah. So and I mean, I think that that would be the case whether there were six people in the audience that night or 600 or whatever, but it's like, um as far as how it manages to reach people or connect with people, like certainly we've had certain songs that have gone out into the ether in ways that I like couldn't have ever imagined. Like the first Son Lux song that I ever played on before I joined the band, um, was on that 2013 album. That was the first one that we toured. The song is called Easy, and I remember it, like I almost didn't even play on it. And Ryan, I had been doing this recording session for a collaboration that Ryan was doing with Sufjan Stevens and Serengeti. And so he sent me some stuff for that. And then right at the last minute before the session started, he sent this other song through and he was like, hey, can you like also put something down on this one? And yeah, I like, there's like a looping figure that's like almost all just like a single note, and then there's a portion of the song that has this like fraying, crackling, melodic sort of fragments, that like feel like little like embers from a campfire or something. And that was this like multi-layered guitar solo thing that I recorded that was so strange, and that Ryan did a very strange thing too. And but like when we made that song, we would have never imagined that like millions and millions of people would listen to that thing. Like it was just like the furthest thing from our minds. And it's a weird song. Like it really is. I like still can't believe that it has been as popular as it is. But it also, like I think it hit at a moment when people had an interest in these things that were especially sort of stripped down, and it has certain elements in it that I can see how they're like have a sort of earwormy quality, and there's like a certain relentlessness about it, even as minimal as it is, and a haunting thing that it has. So it's like I can look at it, try to like put myself outside of it and look at it and be like, okay, I can see how this, in the context of some of the other music that was coming out around that time, might have worked its way into all of these things. But like it's been in films, it's been in fashion campaigns, it's been in commercials, it's like done all this stuff, and so that's what I mean about like you can't necessarily predict how these things will work, but more than that, it's just cool that it does. Like I'm just
Yeah.
glad that it does, because I get to do this.
Yeah, no,
um
you never know, and of course, I
yeah,
mean, as I was saying before, that thing about people say, well, you need to follow one thing and don't mix things up and don't do all that kind of stuff.
yeah,
But it's the bands that don't do that that become the biggest. It's kind of like if you just want to follow the trend and do something, well, you have a chance at being mildly successful. If you want to be huge, you have to be the Beatles, who didn't do any of that, or Radiohead, who didn't do any of that, or Bjork, who didn't do any of that, or virtually every other superstar in music in any field did not
yeah.
do what everybody else was doing. But of course, at some point, somebody probably told them, you shouldn't be doing that. but no, I'm just glad you did, and I'm glad you guys are having this success. So when is the tour starting, and where are you going?
So we have one festival show in Iowa City on April 8th, I think, and then the tour formally starts on the 25th, I want to say, and or maybe it's 26th. Oh man, I should know this stuff. But we're starting in DC, and we're kind of making like a big circle around North America. And so we're going like up through New York and Boston and Vermont into Montreal and Toronto, and then back down into Detroit, and we're going up to Seattle and down the West Coast through LA, and then we're going, into the Southwest, and we make our way to Colorado and down to Texas, and then you
Nashville.
know, we like basically are like circling everything, but we're not making it to North Carolina. We like go as far as Atlanta, and then we cut back up And we play Indianapolis and Chicago, I think, at the very end. So
So,
yeah, and I'm from North Carolina, so it's like I'm especially sad that we don't have a North Carolina show on this tour. But
and no Nashville date.
we are playing Nashville. Yeah, we
Oh,
are playing Nashville. We're
you know
playing.
where?
I can tell you. Give me 1 second.
Because I may have
Um,
to put on a hazmat suit and come see.
yeah, we're at. It's towards the end. I think that's. Yeah, Exit In.
Oh my,
Yeah,
okay, yeah.
Exit In on.
Well, I know where they are. I've never been to it, but I know exactly where they are. Yeah.
Yeah, June 1st. And we've actually played there before. We had a really memorable night in Nashville that night. There was like, yeah, that was a special one. I'm excited to come back.
Cool. Yeah. Well, hopefully, depending on the COVID situation, I would love to come see you guys because, as I've told you, yeah, I mean, your performance at Big Ears, which I'm devastated I'm going to miss this year,
Oh, yeah.
but yeah, your performance at Big Ears a couple of years ago was one of my favorite musical experiences, and
Oh, man.
in recent memory,
You.
yeah, it was just amazing. And and the Son Lux band is, the more I listen to it, it's just it's big, taken on this "where have you been all my life"
Oh, wow.
feeling, because yeah, it's just, you think of it, it is, the music isn't simple, and
Mhm.
it's not particularly straight ahead, but it is so accessible on a certain level, and it's so memorable on a certain level that, I mean, I listen to through the, I guess, the three records once, and then the next time when I go back to them, I go, oh yeah, I remember this song, and I remember it's more the songs. I mean, there are some songs that are more, that kind of earwormy poppy thing, but yeah, of course, I heartily recommend that everybody check it out, because it's great stuff. And have a great tour, a
Thank
safe
you.
tour, and a
Yeah.
great tour. And if I don't see you in Nashville until the next time we talk.
Yeah, I'll look forward to that. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. And until soon, hopefully.
Okay, take
Yep.
care,
All right.
Rafi.